Number 8. Hidden Passenger. In February 2022, a Canadian woman received the shock of her life when she found a man living in her car. Bethany Coker is a Red Seal diesel mechanic who drives her Subaru sedan all the time. In fact, she runs multiple errands in a day since that's what her work entails. At some point though, she started seeing bizarre stuff inside her car. For instance, one morning when she got in for work, she realized the driver's seat was covered in mud. Now she usually steam cleaned her upholstery, which could only mean someone had broken into her car and slept overnight. Then again, no one was actually there, so she just kept driving around like usual. It only took a couple of days for things to really escalate though when her windows started fogging up out of nowhere. Of course, this made her very suspicious since someone had to be inside for this to happen. Well, she got in and said, "Hello." In response, she heard a muffled, "Hey," coming from the vehicle's trunk. Yup, a man had been living there. She immediately opened it to see a naked homeless man inside. And when she asked why he was there, he replied, "It's a rite of passage. I'm the son of the Pope." Obviously, she called the cops, who actually didn't even believe her at first. Still, they got to the scene pretty quickly and took him into custody. What's more, he was apparently a missing person, so they sent him to the psych ward. Here's the most bizarre thing though. The naked man had been living in Coker's car for 3 entire days. And yes, that includes all the grocery and work trips she took. Not to mention, the dude didn't say a single word while in there. According to the police, he had severe health issues and is now thankfully receiving the help he desperately needs. Number 7. Friends for life. You know what's worse than driving around with a random man in your trunk? Having your dead friend in there. 58-year-old Eric Holland and 65-year-old Richard Miller were co-workers from the Vegas area. In fact, their relationship had developed into a friendship over the years. There was something off though, since someone saw them arguing one day near Lake Mead. Obviously, there's nothing inherently suspicious about that. What was suspicious though, was the fact that Miller went missing a few days after. And when an employee of his turned up at his houseboat on the lake, he was nowhere to be seen. That's when authorities decided to step in and find the missing man, a chase that led them to Holland. The gears really started turning when investigators found surveillance footage that showed Holland buying construction-grade garbage bags and even a power saw. Holland wasn't ready to get caught. He led the police on a pretty long chase. In fact, they had to use a helicopter to finally track him down since he'd switched vehicles halfway through, from a Toyota Tundra to a Chevy Avalanche. When he was caught, police discovered something extremely disturbing in his pickup truck, which by the way was a stolen vehicle. They found a bunch of coolers that had been taped closed, and there was a really strong stench, as if something had been decaying inside. He'd been carrying Miller's severed head and body parts in his truck. Also, while Holland denied the allegations because it was a stolen vehicle, the puzzle pieces fell into place once prosecutors saw multiple bullet wounds on Miller matching Holland's gun. Interestingly, he eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, but the reasoning behind him cutting up his friend remains shrouded in mystery to this day. Number 6. Free car. In September 2021, 2 Mississippi men found an abandoned car and they thought it'd be a good idea to go joyriding. Little did they know, they'd just made a terrible mistake. 24-year-old Jordan Thompson and 21-year-old Joshua Hankins were your average Joe carjackers. They did a bunch of petty crimes. So when they found this completely unattended, good-looking car in the middle of the street, they thought they'd hit the jackpot. As it turns out, the reality was far worse. Apparently, they were arrested not long after jacking the vehicle and charged with auto theft. According to them, the windshield had a free car sign on it. Of course, it was a blatant lie they'd made up to avoid being arrested. How did the police know this? Well, because the car actually belonged to a missing person. Here's the real stinger though. The man who was missing, Anthony McCrillis, was dead in the trunk of the car. Yup, they'd gone on a joyride with a dead body in the back. Not to mention, Anthony had been murdered. Now Thompson and Hankins weren't charged with killing him, but they were still caught because of the car. What's more, they were carrying drugs and guns on them, making matters even worse. Still, while getting prison time is bad, we're sure discovering a dead body in the car you've been driving scars you for life. And now for number 5, But first, it's shout-out time. Big thank you to Rachel Black and RC Colorado for supporting this channel. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and join the Badger fam. Number 5. High stakes. In 1991, a professional gambler went missing after leaving the Raynham dog track, only to be found dead. Now, over 30 years later, his cold case murder has finally been solved. 53-year-old Howard Farini was a professional gambler and usually bet on dog races back in the day. One random afternoon, he left the track to go home in Berkeley, telling his friends he'd be back later. He never actually did, though. When Farini didn't return that evening, his friends were obviously surprised and went looking for him, only to find nothing. He wasn't at his house or office. In fact, everything was fully locked, as if no one had even visited the place. Of course, he was soon reported missing, kickstarting investigations. Fast forward a week later, and the police finally found his Cadillac on the 4th floor of a random parking lot at Logan International Airport. Apparently, an employee had noticed a strong smell from the car. Yeah, you can probably tell where this one's going. His body was found in the trunk. Interestingly, he still had his gold jewelry and $6,000 in cash, meaning it wasn't a simple robbery. What's more, his skull was fractured, meaning he'd been attacked with a hammer. Still, that wasn't the actual cause of death, since according to the autopsy, he died of asphyxiation from the plastic bag tied around his head. Also, when cops went back and broke into his home, they found blood stains, which meant he'd been attacked. Sadly, no potential suspect could be found back then. But now, 30 years later, the police finally traced the fingerprint DNA on the plastic bag, linking the murder to Kevin Hanrahan, a freelance enforcer for a Patriarcha crime family member. Unfortunately, Hanrahan was also shot and killed in 1992. Number 4. Falling dominoes. In 1977, an Indiana woman went into her garage to check on her husband's car, only to find him dead on the floor. What she saw after that, though, was even worse. Harriet Carr lived with her husband Melvin Ted Carr, who'd always been a bit of a troublemaker. The dude not only scammed a bunch of people, but he allegedly also kidnapped a hitchhiking couple and sexually assaulted one of them. What's more, he'd been accused of murder as well. Now that was 30 years ago, and to be fair, the charges were all dropped. But in the early hours of April 20th, 1977, Harriet discovered the worst crime her husband had ever committed. He was dead on the floor, and from the looks of it, it seemed he'd collapsed while running a vacuum hose from the car's tailpipe to the trunk. So Harriet knew there was something fishy happening. Lo and behold, as soon as she lifted up the trunk, she found the dead bodies of 3 people: a young mother, Karen Nils, her 2-year-old son, and a 17-year-old girl named Sandra Harris. Not to mention, Ted also had a gun in his pocket. Later, autopsies revealed that all 4 of them died from carbon monoxide poisoning. Apparently, Ted had kidnapped the women, sexually assaulted them, then forced them into the trunk of his car where he murdered them with the gas. In his haste to dispose of the bodies, he opened the trunk too soon and inhaled carbon monoxide himself, which of course killed him on the spot. Interestingly, Harriet had no idea about her husband's serial killer tendencies before his death, and to this day, no one really knows how many people he murdered in his lifetime. Number 3. Abandoned. In February 2022, a Nashville woman suddenly stopped responding to her family's calls and texts. After some digging, the investigators found something horrific. 40-year-old Charlie Marie Cool didn't fight with someone or anything like that. In fact, she was a jolly person who always lit up the room. Even though she struggled with drug and alcohol addiction, it never really developed to such an extent that it'd bring harm to those around her. One day, Charlie just stopped responding to messages. Her loved ones called over and over again to no avail, so of course, she was reported missing. Here's the fascinating part. She wasn't at her apartment, and her car had no signs of suspicious activity. Fast forward to 6 weeks later, and the police finally stumbled upon something after searching every corner of the city. They found an abandoned Dodge Charger on a busy Paragon Mills road. Her dead body was in the back seat, which makes the whole situation so bizarre, because on such a well-traveled road, someone should have walked up and seen her, right? Well, apparently not. Investigations revealed that Charlie had been shot multiple times. No one really knows who or why someone would kill her though, since she just wasn't that kind of person. Still, her family is determined to find the killer and not let the case go cold until justice is served. Number 2. Rough Patch. In May 2016, Tampa police were called after a landlord found blood inside their Hillsborough County property. The tenants? Well, they were nowhere to be seen. 45-year-old Tina Ryan struggled for years, and even though her family and children loved her, she just wanted to get away from Massachusetts. So one day she moved all the way to Florida and started living with 44-year-old Kydell Weldon. The couple didn't have a great relationship. Weldon was often abusive towards her. In fact, at one point, Tina informed her friends about how fearful she'd become. It's worth mentioning that she was trying to find a new job and place to live, since she wanted to break out of the abusive cycle. But Weldon wasn't ready to accept this reality. Apparently, in the middle of the night, the pair got into an argument that turned into a full-on assault. When the landlord arrived, all they found was blood everywhere. It was 3 hours later that deputies found Weldon in a vehicle about 15 minutes away. And yup, he was covered in blood. Of course, he was taken into custody on the spot, but it was a little too late. Ryan's dead body was found in the trunk, and according to the sheriff's office, she'd suffered blunt trauma to the head and multiple stab wounds. According to her daughter, Ryan had been through some rough patches, but nothing quite as serious as this. So all she wanted to do was ask this monster why he'd killed her mother. Weldon, on the other hand, was full of remorse after his arrest, saying he'd messed up and that he was the worst person in the world. He was later charged with first-degree murder. Number 1. Case closed. In 2008, a Port Neches man went missing after he was last seen leaving an IHOP restaurant in his Acura sedan. And 14 years after that report, the case has finally been resolved. 25-year-old Adrian Lozoya was last seen at around 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning, but sadly, he never made it home. What's more, even though he was reported missing and investigations were carried out, no one found a trace of where he'd gone. No car, no body, literally nothing. As if he disappeared into thin air. Almost 14 years after that incident though, Lozoya's case has finally been cracked. Port Arthur police and firefighters were searching for another missing man, Elton Dwayne Harris, when they used sonar detection tech in a canal almost 3 miles north of the IHOP. And guess what? They found not one but 2 cars under the water. Lozoya's Acura was one of them. Sadly though, there wasn't much left of him, and the only thing they did find in his car was a bunch of bones. Still, the bones were sent to the University of North Texas, and it was later confirmed that they did belong to Lozoya. Not to mention the other man, Harris, was also found dead. Thanks for watching. What's the most bizarre thing you've ever found in your car? Let us know in the comments down below. See you next time on The Bad Badger.